This lecture is on life after the war, a time period known as Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. But this lecture is on Reconstruction and then basically life after the war. Okay, so Reconstruction, as I said, time period 1865 to 1877, and it is a time period where the country is rebuilding, and it's rebuilding all over, and your southern states are being readmitted back into the Union. And so the war is over. The war is over April 9th, 1865, when General Lee will surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Appomattox Courthouse is actually a small village in Virginia, and it was named after the courthouse, i.e. Appomattox Courthouse. But it was a small town village where he actually surrendered. Okay, freed women. This is the newly freed slaves. As I mentioned kind of before, during the war, and it's kind of be the same after the war. Women are going to do many different things after the war is over. And a lot of it is just personal decision on what various people want to do. Some chose to look for other family members and trying to unite with family, because during the Civil War, during slavery, families were broken up very frequently. So many basically were looking for family members, and that could be all over the South, or it could actually be into the North. So it just kind of is depending on where they find or where they think family members are. Marriage was now a legal institution for them, so many of them made their marriages legal. Some chose to work for a wage at their current location. This is something I suggested during the Civil War. Many times they'll say, well, this is the only life I've known, this is the only work I've known. And so they'll actually work on the plantation or the farm of where they used to work as a slave, but now they actually have to be paid. They'll be paid, but it's definitely going to be a very low wage. And the idea with that is, or the situation with that is, it basically puts them into a cycle of poverty, which is extremely hard to get out of. Okay, so have that. Some chose to basically said, well, we were field hands, we know how to farm. They want to have their own farm. The problem with that is they don't have the money to buy the land, and so they get into what's known as sharecropping. Sharecropping is when you rent land from a landowner, and instead of like giving them money, paying them money for rent and all the supplies that they need because they don't have it, they basically say they will give them a share of the crop. And it's a contract that will say, and it's usually in the South, it's usually very high. It's usually like 40% of their crop. The issue with sharecropping, once again, is going to put them into poverty in some way, shape, or form, or at some point in time. At some point in time, you're going to have a bad year, and your harvest is not going to be that great, and you still have to give 40% of that crop. And so it will definitely put, sharecropping usually puts a person into debt. And once you're in debt, it's extremely hard to get out of. Some, or I should say many, are going to choose to get an education. The level of education is obviously a very personal choice. Some people just want to be literate. Some people want to learn a skill. Some people actually want that full education of what we would consider like high school education, and some will actually choose to go on and get a college education. So that is going to be a major thing for the slaves to do. And how they're going to, and one of the ways to be educated is through what's called the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau is set up by the federal government, and they're basically setting up schools to provide education for African Americans. Okay, those that want to go north basically make their way north. They're looking for work. They're looking perhaps for family if they realize or knew that family went up north. When they do go north and they find work, they usually can find work, but work is usually behind the scenes. It's laundress, cooks, janitors, domestic servants, seamstresses, and it's usually behind the scenes type of job, and it's usually low paying jobs. In general, women, any former slave, in general, the women are definitely going to face many challenges. As I said, you're going to be taking very low wages. That sets you into poverty. There will be a lot of sexual harassment that goes along with it. And they can't really complain about it, because if they complain about something, then they'll find themselves without a job. So many people basically just put up with it, with the sexual harassment or just the poor conditions. I know I said that many African Americans are going to be looking for schools, and that is very true. But there's a kind of a little bit of a catch. Every once in a while, the schools will deny African Americans, especially with the prejudice there. Even though the slaves are free and they're trying to start this life, there's still prejudice. And even in the North, I know that sounds kind of odd, because they fought for the end of slavery. They had the abolitionist cause, but it doesn't mean that everybody sees the African Americans as equal, and a lot of people don't see them as equal. So this is where you kind of get that catch with schools, depending on who's running the school, what kind of school it is. They can actually still have a hard time getting access to school, especially if it's not a school designed for African Americans. Okay, so we've got that. Now, another thing that will happen. This will start in the South, and starts in the South, primarily in the South, but will definitely spread to other parts of the country, and that is secret white societies. Secret white societies are what we know as the Ku Klux Klan, also what's known as the White Camellias, or the Knights of the White Camellias. And these are secret societies that are there to keep the African American community in an inferior position. They want to basically spread fear within the African American community, so they won't go looking for jobs, they won't live in certain areas, and it's all about keeping them in an inferior position. So yes, the freedmen have their freedom, but there's a huge amount of challenges within the United States. Okay, now, this is something I had mentioned before that I wanted to pick up. Helping the freed women, or the freedmen, however you want to look at it. As I said, many of your newly freed slaves basically want education. And so the federal government is definitely going to deal with that, and they're going to set up with what's known as the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau, as I mentioned, is a federal government agency that is going to provide a lot of things. It's an institution that's going to provide food, medicine, housing, education to the freedmen. They will have offices in the South where a freedman can go into these offices, especially in the very beginning, right after the Civil War. They can get some food, some clothing. They can kind of figure out where they want to go, and they might even get a situation, some access into housing. But one of the big focuses of the Freedmen's Bureau was education, was setting up schools. And so right after the war, there's going to be $3 million spent on education. And this is to provide education to an estimated, at this point in time, 150,000 to over 200,000 freedmen right after the war. And it's going to and it actually works. Between 1865 and 1872, they're actually going to increase the literacy rate by 30% of the freedmen. And so, or your African American community. So that is definitely considered to be a huge success of the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay? And women are definitely getting access into education with that. But there's also another thing that makes it important for women at this point in time, is that women are going to account for 50% of the teachers in the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, when you talk about that, it's white and black. Many African American women, teachers, women who are educated, want to basically help out their fellow man, and so they will definitely be teachers within the Freedmen's Bureau. And so women will benefit from Freedmen's Bureau, and they will also participate within the Freedmen's Bureau. African American women also provided education, whether it's from the Freedmen's Bureau, but also they'll provide education like through churches that will provide schools, charities that will open up schools for the freedmen. So women, definitely Black and white women, will definitely be a part of the educational process of the freedmen's. Okay, now moving on, and also Freedmen's Bureau, I believe, is a slide on the PowerPoint. Okay, Southern women, Southern white women. Once the war is over, it's basically trying to get their life back to normal. And I say that, and it's not that easy. Getting back to life in the South is actually very difficult because, as I mentioned, most of the battles were fought in the South, and the South is going to be destroyed. And so you have communities, you have farmland that is ravished, you have cities that are bombed, decimated, ravished. And so that's what you have to deal with. But also women on both sides, but definitely for the Confederacy, you have a lot of men that A, do not come home from the war. B, if they do come home from the war, they might have major illnesses, injuries. Injuries where they actually cannot function the way they used to. They might be missing a leg, they might be missing an arm, or they might have an injury where they just can't function like they once did. And so what that does is it puts a huge amount of pressure and workload onto the women, especially in the South, because it's the woman that has to get the farms back going, the family businesses back going. And so that's going to be a heavy burden that the women are going to have to deal with in the South. Talk about that. An example would be Frances Butler from Georgia. Her father died in the war. Frances, during the war and then after the war, will actually take over the management of the rice and cotton fields. She actually did very well. She actually was a good manager. She was educated and she negotiated labor contracts. She did contracts for the harvest, the selling of the harvest. It will take several years to actually turn a profit again, but she will create a profitable farm and get back to basically where the farm was once before the Civil War. And so here's a woman that basically has to do it herself. And there's really no other choices. When you talk about lower class, lower, kind of like low middle class, kind of edging onto poor, women a lot of times had to work. In the sense they had to pick up other work. They had to work factory jobs. They had to just pick up other work to actually bring money in, because you can't just plow your field over, plant a crop, and it's going to grow. Because you've had fire, you've had bombing, and so it's actually going to take several years for a farm to actually become profitable. And so even though, yeah, sure, women are going to like till the land and plant, they're actually not going to get a profitable crop for probably a few years. And so what that means is that if you don't have other means, you're going to have to go back to work, and many women will go back to work. What you're going to see after the Civil War is there's going to be a lot of Reconstruction, and there's going to be a development of industry in the South, and there's going to be some more factories developed in the South. And so they definitely need workers, and you will see these women as in low middle class, poor women going into the factories because it provides jobs, it provides an income. Okay, women in general, so both North and South. Many women are seeing, okay, so let me back up. 1869, with the 15th Amendment, African-American males are going to get the right to vote. And so many women across the country, right, are seeing that the African-American men are getting the right to vote. And that's kind of spurring them to saying, hey, we want the right to vote too. And there's actually an argument with the 15th Amendment because African-American women wanted to be included on that. They thought it was kind of like an opportunity to kind of get the right to vote. And many people believed that it wouldn't pass if the wording said men and women in the 15th Amendment. And so they didn't put the wording of women into the 15th Amendment. And they said, but at least we want African-American males to vote. So it kind of depends on what side of the coin you're on how you feel with that. Many women were offended and truly were hurt and just felt like it was another blow to them with the wording of the 15th Amendment and the passage of the 15th Amendment. But anyway, okay, what it does is it's going to get women kind of basically going again. They're like, okay, we have to fight it. We have to start the fight once again, pick up where we left off, and, try and fight for the right to vote. Okay, so there is that. So I want to introduce that concept because it's going to kind of get them going, but I'm going to develop that in a little bit later in my lecture. Okay, then if you're talking about the North, women in general basically are returning to their lives, and it's basically returning to normal home life, getting the family business going and functioning again, farming, if you're in farming like in New York and Pennsylvania, but it's basically kind of getting their normal lives back together. Yes, there's going to be a little bit more of a burden on women in the North because you're going to have men that don't return home. You'll have men that will have injuries, kind of the same setup. But the fact is that there's a higher population in the North than in the South. And so that kind of takes a little bit of the burden off the women, because there are definitely men in the North that actually did not fight in the war. And so they can kind of pick up the slack a little bit. And so it's not that much of a burden on women in the North as it is in the South. Okay, for other women, this is women in the North. They will find entries into jobs. There will be job opportunities that will open up to them. There's definitely going to be a boom in factories, both in the North and in the South, and so you'll see women go into the factories, and so there's definitely going to be some job opportunities. But there's other opportunities also. There are going to be more professional jobs opening up to women. You're going to see more women becoming teachers. You will see more women becoming nurses. And so if you're a teacher or a nurse, you would be considered middle class. And so, I mean, it's definitely a better job, better paying job than like working in a factory, that type of thing. So more women, professional women. So more women are going to go into teaching as a profession. By 1870, 60% of teaching positions were now held by women. There are far more colleges opening up for women, more what's referred to as normal schools, which are teaching programs, teacher training programs. But there are other schools that are starting to open up in the I would say like by 1870. Women such as Vassar College, that's in New York, Wellesley College in Massachusetts, Smith College in Massachusetts, all offered classes. Well, these are all colleges for women, and they actually will offer a lot of classes. They will offer your basic classes, but they'll also include math, science, language, art, music, and so they definitely had a wide variety of curriculum for women. If you talk about education in the South, the education in the South still not quite there. Okay, you're going to see what is going to open are going to be normal schools, basically teacher training programs in the South, and so you will definitely see that as job or educational opportunities. College-wise, they're still kind of behind the North in basically creating colleges for women. Okay, if you move out west, in the Midwest and out west, you're going to have the passage of the Morrill Act in 1862. The Morrill Act, M-O-R-R-I-L-L, the Morrill Act basically granted, it's granting of federal funds to colleges in the region. Those colleges had to offer a basic education and also normal schools. And so You're now having the buildup or a development of colleges out west, Midwest, and out west, and it'll provide educational opportunities for women, and they'll definitely be having normal schools or teacher training programs for women. Other issues going on, divorce rate. Divorce rate is actually rising a little bit, and I mean a little bit, but okay. When you're talking about divorces after the Civil War, immediately after the Civil War, when you're talking 1860s, meaning like 65 through 69, divorce rate was about 1.8. And I know that's very small, but it's the fact that that there's a little more opportunity for divorces. The South is still extremely difficult to get a divorce. Okay, controlling births or birth control, that's still a major issue. You will definitely see, it's always been a major issue, it's always controversial, but it'll become very controversial after the Civil War because you have women who still, it doesn't matter to them, they still don't want to have large families. But after the Civil War, because there were so many deaths during the Civil War, you will have a feeling within the country that, in a sense, it's a woman's duty to basically populate the country. And so this whole idea of birth control after the Civil War is going to be highly controversial because people will say, well, we've lost so many people during the Civil War, we can't be controlling births, we should be promoting it. And so it's actually going to be a very, very tricky subject to even deal with because there's many people, not even just the conservative, religious conservatives, but there's just an overall feeling about trying to repopulate, if you will. There's going to be what's in 1875, what's known as the Comstock Law. The Comstock Law is going to be passed 1875. And it's a federal crime to send, what it is it's a federal crime to send obscene material, including birth control information, through the mail. Okay, so one more time. It's a federal crime to send obscene material, including birth control information, through the mail. So this was one way to try to decrease the amount of birth control information. But as I mentioned, it's still a major issue for many women, and so it's definitely an issue that's very underground at this point in time. Okay, now another thing that you will see, and you see a development of after the Civil War, is what's known as women's service organizations. Women had served, had participated a lot in the Civil War, and they had participated a lot in various ways, and a lot of organizations to raise money and to get supplies. And now, after the war, you don't need to do that, but a lot of women are like, I enjoyed it. I know it was about helping out with the war effort, but I really enjoyed being a part of an organization. And so now you're going to see women creating their own organizations. And yes, they might be social organizations, but a lot of times with women, they're going to be organizations that are going to be helping the community. So you're definitely going to see women's service organizations, in a sense, continue or start up in a sense that they're just different types of organizations. You will also see out west, well, you see a lot out west. It's wherever there's a lot of farming. You'll see it in the South also. It's called the Grange. The Grange is of farmers, and it's an organization for farmers to basically help each other out. And it's really obviously run by men, but there will be kind of like an auxiliary to the Grange where the farmers' wives will participate. They'll do newsletters, they'll do newspapers talking about farmers' issues and talking about issues of the Grange. So it's a way that women are participating in their community with one another and what's going on just in their lives. Another organization that is going to be founded is the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association. Now this is definitely urban, okay? This is definitely starting in your urban cities. And the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association, is there to assist working women, and it's primarily there to offer boarding rooms for working women in the city like New York City. And it was, you could basically pay, and you could do it however you wanted. It was either month or like weekly. You could pay for a room. And it was like a boarding room, and they would have bathrooms kind of like at the end of the hallway. But the fact is that if you're new to a city or you don't have a whole lot of money and you're working a factory job, you're not making a lot, YWCA actually is going to be quite attractive to you. And you knew that in the YWCA, you knew the boarding rooms were safe, you knew the area was safe. Now, as that takes off, you're going to see within the YWCA, they'll start to have like classes, like you can like kind of better yourself, like typing classes and shorthand classes. And so this is where like the classes with the YWCA definitely begin at this point in time. But it was really there to support working women. Okay, now as I mentioned before, in the very beginning of this lecture, right after the war, excuse me, the women's rights movement had been put on the back burner. And then when the African American male gets the right to vote with the 13th Amendment, it kind of gets the women kind of thinking. And now you're going to start to see this movement of the women's rights movement. Once things kind of settle down and people feel like, you know, life is somewhat normal, if you will, women are really going to get into this movement. And this is really starting, some of them are actually starting in 1866. Some of them I would say more so about 1869. And then they're kind of building the momentum, really it's going to be big, 1870s, 1880s. And actually they're on out into the 1900s. Okay, so anyway, women's rights movement. Women were definitely, they were, how do I say, they were encouraged by the 15th Amendment, but that's because they were kind of ticked off about it. You know, it gets you going, it gets your fire going, and then it's like, yeah, we're going to do it. So you get this women's rights movement that definitely is going to get them to start creating more organizations. They take the foundation of the Seneca Falls Convention, and then they just build on it. And what you're going to see is the creation of organizations, of like women's rights organizations. And there is a PowerPoint or a slide on my PowerPoint. And you're going to have what's known as ERA, American Equal Rights Association. I'm so sorry. ERA, American Equal Rights Association. This is 1866. Frances Ellen Watkins is it's Frances Ellen Watkins, Mary Ann Carey, Sojourner Truth. They're going to form an interracial organization fighting for women's rights. Unfortunately, and that's 1866. Unfortunately, there's a lot of tension, and as the years go by, there's tension that they can never get rid of the tension. And you're going to, in 1869, they're actually going to basically break off into two groups. Unfortunately, it's going to be basically a white community, a white organization, and a black organization, which is I find extremely frustrating. Because they basically want the same thing. They want the same thing in every way, shape, and form. They want a better women. They want the right to vote. Anyway, in 1869, you're going to have the formation of what's known as the National Women's Suffrage Association. The National Women's Suffrage Association, that's going to be formed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Anthony. Okay? And in this organization, no men are allowed. And it focused on the women's right to vote at a national level. Okay, it focused on the women's right to vote at a national level, and it also supported equal pay and better divorce laws. You'll also then have the formation of the American Women's Suffrage Association, 1869. American Women's Suffrage Association, that is going to be formed by Lucy Stone and Julia Howe. They actually encouraged men to join if that's something men were interested in doing, and they focused on getting the women's right to vote at a state level. Okay, so they're kind of going in two different directions, and then you'll also have the formation of African American women's rights organizations. Okay, now, on one hand, these two groups, they kind of seeing things a little bit differently. One wants to do it at a national level, one wants to do it at a state level. But if you, and I know historically we have the ability to do so, but if you step back, and I don't really think this was the plan of the ladies, but if you step back, it's like, wow, they're covering their bases. One's fighting at a national level, one's fighting it at a state level, and you're covering all your bases. I never really got the feel that that was their intention for doing it. It's because they kind of saw things a little differently. But hey, you should basically kind of run with what works, right? You're covering all your bases on it. Okay, now, with these two organizations, their end result obviously was the same. They just are definitely going about it in a very different way. Now, the American Women's Suffrage Association, the one that basically wanted to get the right to vote at a state level first, in a sense, they're going to do what they set out to do. They're going to send women all over the states. They're definitely going to focus on, they're sending them all over the states, okay? But they're really going to focus on the West because they know that the West is favorable to women. And they've known that, they've heard that, they know women who are out West, they have said that, and so they are really going to concentrate a lot in the West because they're hoping to get the right to vote basically in the Western states. And that is exactly what's going to happen. It's going to be Wyoming. Wyoming is going to be the first state that is going to give women the right to vote, and that is 1869. And so that is that's actually very encouraging. So Wyoming is going to be your first state to give women the right to vote. Utah will be 1896. Colorado will be 1893. Idaho will be 1890. Utah and Idaho are 1896. Colorado 1893. Washington State 1919. California 1911. Oregon and Arizona 1912. Okay, you don't have to memorize the dates, and that's not necessarily my point, but you do have to understand, because all the states that I just listed off, they're all Western states. And that is the concept I want you to get out of this, is that the Western states historically have been favorable to women. And once again, they're going to be favorable to women. They're open to the idea that women should have more rights. Why? Because women pull a lot of the weight in the Western states. They farm, they do cattle ranching, or at least they help their husbands. And so the Western portion of the country historically has been favorable to women, and once again, they continue to be favorable to women. Okay, so I am going to, in a sense, move away from the women's rights movement, okay, and we'll definitely get back to it. But I want to talk about women in the West. Seeing we are there, we will talk about women in the West. We definitely are going to see when you have more people moving westward, and after the Civil War, you have a lot of people moving west for a lot of reasons. There's availability of land. There's going to be the Homestead Act that's there. That's going to, you're able to buy Western land for a very cheap price. Some people just wanted to start over after the Civil War. They're kind of like been over and done. And it's basically, I want a new chapter in my life, and I'm going to go move west. And so you're going to have more people, a lot of more families that are going to move west. With that, you're definitely going to have more confrontations with Native Americans. Some of it can be positive, some of it can be negative. It just depends on how it works out. Okay, now, with that, something that's going on in the West, when you talk about the 1870s, there's going to be this overall feeling in the United States that they want to assimilate the Native Americans. And they're going to assimilate Native Americans by two ways. They do it through the Dawes Plan and through boarding schools. Dawes Plan is basically Native Americans would be given land by the federal government, and they have to work on that land, or basically live on the land, work on the land for 25 years, and they would get the deed, or they would own the property. And it's a way to try and encourage them to get off of the reservation land and have private land. Once again, an American idea. But another big way is by boarding schools. They were basically, a lot of times children were forced, Native American children were forced into boarding schools, or it's all over the sun. Some of them were forced, some kids were kidnapped, some actually, the parents are like, I can't figure out how to win, so why don't I just send the kids to boarding school, because that's what they want. So it was basically all over the sun of like how the kids ended up. But when they go to the boarding schools, they're basically taught to be American. They basically wear American clothing. They are in American-like schools. They have, for women, they have dresses. They wear their hair up in a bun. They have boots on. They take classes like typing and shorthand. They learn how to run a household. Some of the boarding schools, not all of them, had like nursing training programs. The one, Sherman Indian School in Riverside, they actually had, that was a boarding school that was set up in 1900. They actually had a nursing program. So they basically were trying to teach women and teach the children basically skills, so when they got out of school they could basically get a job. Another thing that I should say, there was no speaking of their native language. They had to speak English, and they were basically forced to learn how to be American. So yeah, I mean, and when they come out, some are like, they go back home, they don't want to do that anymore. Some feel like they live a weird life because they have one foot in Native American world, one foot in American world. And some will actually go on, and some actually will go on to college, and they figure if they can get a college degree, some become nurses and have more training for nurses, some actually become doctors, some become lawyers, some become teachers, and they want to take their skill and basically take it back to their home and to their reservation. So it's basically all over the place. Talked about that. Now, Hispanics, or Hispanias. By 1870, Spanish heritage definitely entrenched when you talk about the Southwest, if you will. But when you're talking about the 1870s, you're starting to see more of a segregation happening. You tend to see kind of Spanish, Mexican areas being kind of, I don't want to call it developed, but coming up in the areas, especially when you're talking like Los Angeles, kind of San Diego area. And you kind of tend to see it in cities and areas. They tend to starting to see a little more segregation. When you talk about that, now, unless they own property and have an established ranch and established farming, you tend to see Hispanics go into labor jobs. And when they go into labor jobs, they definitely are low-paying labor jobs. A lot of labor jobs have to do with agriculture. They'll become laborers basically on somebody else's farm. That's unless they have an established ranch or farm, which is financially doing well. When you talk about the Hispanic community, divorce, definitely extremely hard to come by. That is more religion, because Catholic religion. You definitely see a lot of intermarriages, though. You'll see intermarriages with all various people, whether it's Native American or definitely the white community. You'll definitely see intermarriages. Talked about that. When you talk about white women coming out west, a lot of them are coming out because of the Homestead Act, and they're still doing the same thing. They're still doing the same thing of, maintaining a basic family farm, that type of thing. You'll also see kind of a development of the Mormons. You see the Mormons really kind of reaching out after the Civil War, trying to find different places to set up Mormon communities. So you will see them kind of moving around west. They'll be out in California. establishing kind of like the San Bernardino area. And so you'll see them a lot out in the West, kind of establishing communities. African American women, a lot of women, I shouldn't say a lot, but a good amount of women are going to move westward. They're trying to basically start a new life. They might hear about some job opportunities or just getting away from what's going on in the South and what's going on in the East. But once again, it's what I've talked about before. There's still prejudices. They still don't have any rights. When they do get jobs, they're behind the scenes jobs, domestic servants, laundresses, cooks, that type of thing. And it definitely sets them up into poverty. And something I had talked about before, and it's definitely a situation that they're still in. You will see some Freedmen's Bureau schools open up in the West. Texas had a few Freedmen's Bureaus. You'll see a few Freedmen's Bureau schools out in the West. And they will definitely take advantage of that. Now, you have some success stories, some, if you want to call it deviant women, or some success stories, however you want to say it. You have a woman by the name of Mary Pleasant, African-American woman. She is a free woman living in San Francisco. This is 1849, so this is prior to the Civil War. She will marry, and they will be basically a free couple in San Francisco. The couple owned a restaurant and boarding house, and a laundry service. And they actually became very wealthy. And so it was a very wealthy couple living in San Francisco. Another woman, Clara Brown, she will purchase her freedom and then move into Colorado. In Colorado, she worked as a nurse, and then she also invested in mining. And this is like 1866. And she actually became extremely wealthy because of the mining, her investment in the mining in Colorado. Okay, another group of people I want to talk about, the Asian community in the West. And in this sense, I am talking about Chinese and then Japanese. Getting to the Chinese, more Chinese are coming into the United States at this point in time. The Chinese men are working on the Transcontinental Railroad that's being built in the 60s. They'll be working on the Transcontinental Railroad. They're taking labor jobs. And then the women that are coming over, once again, they're taking labor jobs. Domestic servants, laundresses, seamstresses, cooks, also prostitutes. So you definitely see them working labor jobs. But I will also comment that by San Francisco at this time has a very vibrant, very rich Chinese Chinatown in San Francisco, and also the Chinatown that is starting to develop in Los Angeles. So they definitely have communities, if you're in those two regions, to basically go to, that the community would support them. Japanese, when you talk about the Japanese, I would say the Japanese are starting to come into California. They come into California, and they're kind of in the West. Probably about 1868 is when you're starting to see them come in. They're going to create like little Tokyos in kind of some major cities. They usually come over as a family, and they usually will have, they actually will get into, well, no, there's a lot of different things they will do. They might start up a business, but you also see them work on land. They might be laborers for a period of time, but they want to just save all their money. And the idea is they want to be laborers for like 4 or 5 years, save their money, open that family business, or maybe buy land and actually have a family farm. And so you will actually see very briefly the Japanese doing some like farm labor work, but it's basically a stepping stone. It's a way for them to save a little bit of money because they know they want to go on to do other things. And then really that's what you see them do. You see them, they start to have their family and that establishing family, establishing home. And you have them running family businesses, family farms. All right, and that is my lecture for life after the Civil War.